Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. With Visions making their grand big return for The War Within Season 2, not only are we getting access to a number of collectibles from transmogs and mounts, but also a bunch of corruptions, which are powerful new effects that you'll want to slap on your gear as soon as possible. Very similar to the corruptions of Battle for Azeroth, though not as all-consuming as they were back in the day, literally covering your gear head to toe. This time around, they're coming back as a Helm enchant, the one that is significant enough in power that you will want to add to your current armor sets for raids and dungeons. And out of all the corruptions that brought back in, they brought in some of the ones that were more consistent, but also some of the ones that were more visually interesting, from spawning tentacles of Nazah to sear at your targets, to big beams of void to blast everything in front of you. There's a lot of cool effects and a lot of strong winds, in fact, as well, and they're also easy to swap out in with a new corruption vendor. However, no corruption is made equal, and some classes will prefer one over another. So if you are going to be picking up a corruption for Season 2 content to finish out your endgame grinds, then you'll want to pick the one that best serves your class and spec. And that's essentially what I want to cover in this video, going over the best in-slot corruptions for every single class and spec out there for any of you that are finishing out your endgame objectives within Season 2 content. As always, if you guys want to see more regular updates for War Within expansion, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So to unlock corruptions in the first place, you have to complete a short quest line that shows you the basics of the visions. When you initially log in, it'll run you through a very first vision. It'll show you how to get upgrades for your hourglass in order to get all the different bonuses, and then it'll give you a quest line to enhance your corruptions, either giving you the beginning quest line, which will give you lesser corruptions, and then later down the line there'll be another quest line for greater corruptions. After you complete that, you'll be able to purchase corruptions directly from Ogmermu. Okay, got the name wrong completely. But initially, you'll be able to buy all lesser corruptions anytime you want to for 500 displaced mementos. This is a warbound currency that can be traded across all characters, so the lesser are going to cost you 500. The greaters, you'll be able to get one for free from a questline, and then those will run you about 2,000 later. So switching out corruptions can sometimes be difficult, or at least kind of expensive, but at least you can farm visions infinitely, and for many classes out there, you don't actually switch corruptions except in a handful of situations. Now, corruptions will be an item that will be warbound to a character, so you can purchase them on one store in your bank, pick them up on alts if you want to, but the currency is also warbound as well. They are right now a enchant for your helmet. So they're not going to be all consuming like the war back in BFA, where every single slot of your gear had corruptions. Only one is going to have that corruption, which means they'll be effective, though in limited capacity, compared to how you could stack them way back in BFA. And many of the corruptions that are brought in for this update have been one of the more powerful corruptions, from the tentacle that beams your target, the star, you got Twilight Devastation beam that cuts across things, Echoing Void, Gushing Wind, as well as one that increases your secondary stats, which is Void Ritual. So there are some corruptions that are missing, like the ones that augmented your mastery, crit, haste, versatility, crit damage, or even gave you cooldown reduction on certain abilities, but for the most part, most of the powerful effects from back in BFA have been brought in for the revisited version of Horrific Visions. Before we dive into the actual individual classes, I did want to make a quick section on the Echoing Void corruption, and it's a bit of a conundrum, as Echoing Void technically, for many classes out there, is the best corruption. However, it doesn't seem to be functioning nearly as well as it did on PTR. It's not as consistent, it does generally lower damage output because of its consistency. It can also sometimes proc when you're not even in combat, like when you're moving from one trash bag to another in a Mythic Plus dungeon. So there's a lot of weirdness going on with this one, resulting in way less damage. So I am going to still name a number of classes and specs that will be using Echoing Void because it is absolutely the best option for them on paper. Just in practice, it is not doing super well. If they fix it, maybe I'll add some kind of like an alert for this video, maybe like in the comments, or maybe I'll just add in the description, something along those sorts. If they fix it, then Echoing Void is back in the menu for many of you. But if they don't, it is going to be a little bit weaker, so there are alternatives that I will name for any of you that are Echoing Void users. However, from here on, we can start with the first class on the list, alphabetically, the Death Knight. And for Death Knights, it's a really easy option. All three specs are going to be using Void Ritual, which is a corruption that can randomly proc pretty consistently all of your secondary stats, increasing them every second up for 20 seconds. This is good for all three specs generally, because all Death Knight stats are pretty good for Mastery, Crit, Haste, Versatility can be okay too. It's pretty consistent, so it's going to be great for Frost as well as Unholy, and lines up with your cooldowns oftentimes more than not. It's like a 30% proc rate, so it's, or 30% uptime rather, so it's actually really good. For Blood Death Knights, normally you would be running something like Echo and Void, but right now because of the Echo and Void, you will also still run Void Ritual. Void Ritual also helps out Blood Death Knights because their stats are mostly on the defensive value from their mastery and versatility, and proccing that stat specifically actually amplifies your defenses as well. So for Blood as well as the other specs of Death Knight, right now you're looking at Void Ritual as the best corruption option. Next we have the class of Demon Hunter, and for them it's actually very straightforward. Technically the corruptions are different between the two specs, but because of the whole Echo and Void conundrum, we're basically both going to be running Void Ritual for the extra secondary stats. For Havoc, this is huge because you get a more crit, more mastery, and a little bit of haste, a bit of versa is also damage increase, but the crit mastery are pretty massive for you overall. For Vege's Demon Hunter, normally you actually do prefer Echo and Void in like all content, but because of that, you are going to have to settle for the time being with Void Ritual for the secondary stats. Secondary stats are not terrible either for tanky Demon Hunters because that is going to give you more crit, more mastery, more versatility, which does increase your overall survivability, plus also more haste, so you can generate and spend resources a little bit more aggressively. It just ends up being a very all-around good option, but when you're looking for straight damage, eventually, if they ever fix it, Vengeance Demon Hunters will want to swap over to Echoing Void as your best option. Then we have the class of Druid, and if you're someone who plays Druid in multiple roles like tank, healer, DPS, melee, or ranged, you'll be pretty happy to know that you'll be able to easily switch around them because all four of them use Void Ritual as your best corruption. For Druids right now, their secondary stats are actually quite huge. Whether we talk about Feral, even things like Haste, which normally can be underperforming stats, are very strong right now. Balanced Druids also highly prioritize secondary stats. Guardian, that's defensives and offensives, and for Healer, your only good option for corruptions is stats to begin with, so Void Ritual ends up being the one that all four specs are going to share, which makes it a very straightforward, easy option. Next, we have the class of the Evoker, and for both Devastation and Preservation, the choice is very simple. Both of them are going to be prioritizing Void Ritual. For Devastation, you're getting a lot of secondary stats, from crit to haste and mastery, and the uptime of this corruption is fantastic for that playstyle specifically, because they have very strong burst and a strong synergy with secondary stats. It ends up being a very good option. Preservation being a healer, all healers are going to prioritize Void Ritual as like the only viable pick. For Augmentation, however, things are a little bit different. You don't actually prioritize secondary stats as much, but instead you're prioritizing personal damage output, with Augmentation kind of heading in that direction very slowly as they keep upping their personal output. Right now, Gushing Wound from a distance as a ranged DPS, this one seems to be the best option, even in AoE content right now. This one is one that's being highly recommended. There is an alternative playstyle, like if you end up playing Augmentation up in melee. Once they fix it, Echo and Void, if you end up hanging out in melee, technically should be your ultimately best option, but you being a ranged DPS, there's a good opportunity you are going to be staying out range for certain range mechanics, just to make sure that you don't mess up the rest of your group. So Gushing Wound ends up being the one that increases your overall damage the highest in terms of your personal contribution, ends up being the best one that's the highest recommended for all content. Then we have the class of Hunter, and for the Hunter specs, for the most part, you're gonna see Beast Mastery and Survival gravitating towards Void Ritual. For both of those specs, although their secondary stats are very good, the excellent proc rate synergizes well with majority of your damage output, and ends up just being the best overall option for those two specs. Marksmanship, however, in pure single target situations, doesn't value some stats nearly as much as others. So in pure single target, it's just you versus a singular target, Gushing Wound is ahead by a small bit, but enough to actually make you want to prioritize it. So if you're focusing on the most about a single target damage, that is the best option. Though in general play, like in Delves, open world content, Mythic Plus, any cleave, AoE, basically anything that isn't pure single target, Void Ritual is going to be much better. In most cases, like if you don't want to switch corruptions all the time and spend 2000 mementos for every occasion, I think just going with the Void Ritual for marksman and then forgetting about it is fine. But I did want to mention that Gushing Wound is technically better for them in pure raid situations. When it comes to mages, for the most part, both Arcane and Fire are going to be prioritizing Void Ritual. Again, secondary stats for those two specs are generally good, and even though Fire doesn't necessarily love a lot of crit from the Void Ritual, it still is a useful stat. Like, majority of the stats that you gain are going to be a pretty decent boost, plus the uptime is also quite excellent. Where we do see a bit of a deviation is in the spec of Frost specifically, as Frost, unlike the other two, actually tries to reach certain stat caps in terms of the critical strike, to some degree case in some cases. Not as heavily as in the previous expansions, but there is some stat caps that you are trying to reach. So getting random boosts of secondary stats isn't always ideal for you, as you kind of want that consistency. So for them, in pure single target, they actually prefer infinite stars, as I think the only spec that actually like infinite stars. So in pure single target, could be that infinite stars maybe has a bit of a better interaction because of the haste buff with ice evades, but in pure single target, that's what they prefer. However, if you are going to play in your Frost Mage in melee, like if you are going to be really playing within 15 yards of enemy targets, like in AoE or in single target, technically Echoing Void, if it wasn't bugged, would be the best option. But because of the way that Echoing Void right now works, and also the fact that you have to play in melee as a range class, it does create a bit of a weird situation. In AoE content though, Void Ritual is going to be overall better. So in most cases, as a mage, if you're going to be doing a lot of delves, open world content, AoE, cleave, Myth Plus dungeons in particular, I think Void Ritual will be your best option. But if you're a mage that's going to be raiding, it looks like the Infinite Stars in pure single target might actually be one of your better options if you are just trying to pump the most amount of single target damage output. From there, we have the class of Monk. For monks, though, it would seem like for both Brewmaster and Windwalker, you normally would like something like a Echoing Void, but because of the bugs, you're kind of defaulting to not the best options, but still decent ones. For Brewmaster, Void Ritual is going to be your really good option, just again, because Echoing Void is bugged. Once they fix it, it actually might be pretty good. Though there's an argument to be made about running Echoing Void, or Void Ritual rather, for the stats, because they provide you good defensives as a Brewmaster. It does give you more stats, which can actually make you a little bit tankier. Mistweavers, because you're a healer, Void Ritual is like your only viable option. For Windwalker, however, though, in pure single target raid fights, Gushing Wind ends up being your best option in terms of just most consistent single target damage. But in AoE content, you are going to be defaulting into a Void Ritual. I think in most cases, if you just go Void Ritual, just so you don't have to swap around, you're fine. However, if majority of the time you spend in-game is raiding, then Gushing Wound would actually be a significant gain within single target damage. Next class we have on the list is the Paladin, and they're very easy to please, as they're all going to be running Void Ritual. As a healer, Void Ritual is the only corruption that increases your healing, so that's a must-have. As a tank, Protection, it is the only one that increases your survivability, but also can give you more resource generation, which is massive, as it's a good portion of your overall damage, but also survivability as well. And for Retribution, your secondary stats are all kind of good. So the more stats you increase, the harder you're going to hit, which ends up being your best option in terms of the most amount of damage gain. So for Paladins, it's a very straightforward option. Then we have the class of Priest, and because you have 2 out of your 3 specs being healers, both of them are going to default to Void Ritual as like your only viable corruption that increases your overall healing. For Shadow, like Paladin, you have very good secondary stats, so increasing those directly increases your damage far better than any of those corruptions would. Way back in the day, Priest used to have a cool interaction with a ton of different hastes that you could collect from the initial playstyles way back in the day. The more haste you got, the more crit you got, the more powerful and the more often your corruptions would proc. That is really not the case anymore. So right now, secondary stats just to amplify your damage seems to be like the most consistent option, which ends up being a very simple choice for the class of Priest. Just go with Void Ritual. Now, for the class of Rogue, I am just going to show one bag because the rest of my bags are a mess, so I do apologize about that, but normally Rogues would prefer all 3 specs, would love Echoing Void on paper. However, because it's bugged, because it's not super consistent until it gets fixed, Echoing Void is really not on the table. This does leave Rogues with a very unique situation, as we end up running corruptions that offer us additional damage instead of secondary stats, where technically Assassination can maybe run the secondary stats because it's like the only one that can really utilize it. The other ones are actually pretty consistent for that class specifically. Like Gushing Wound ends up being the best choice for all 3 specs of Rogue for pure single target, so this would be used in raid. So if you do a lot of raiding or like even out rogues for Mythic Plus, Gushing Wood is actually not that far different from single target to AoE damage. It does provide you more priority damage, which is kind of what rogues are really good at anyway. So Gushing Wood is kind of like the hit-all recommendation for most content, but definitely a must-have when it comes to raiding. However, Rogue, I think, is the only spec right now that can utilize Twisting or Twilight Devastation, which can do a ton of AoE damage into enemies in front of you, with a bit of a caveat. While this one technically on paper might be the best for AoE, it can do a number of weird things, like it continues to travel forward, so if you're looking at an enemy and the beam continues to travel forwards, it can pull mobs behind it that you didn't mean to pull. It also can sometimes proc while you're in stealth, so if you're just trying to sit in stealth, and as long as if you have like, any other procs or buffs rolling, it can randomly hit stuff out of stealth. So yeah, technically on paper, when everything lines up, Twilight Devastation should be a good option in AoE, but because of this like randomization and lack of control, Gushing Wind ends up being why it is kind of like the default option for many rogues out there, at least as of this moment, until they fix Echoing Void. The next class on the list is the Shaman, and this one is very straightforward. All three specs are going to be utilizing Void Ritual, mostly because all three specs have very strong secondary stats that do a ton for you, from haste to critical strike damage interactions for elemental, fairly strong masteries, even versatility is an okay stat. So because you have such good secondary stats for the most part that are very, very impactful, this one ends up being the most consistent option. It has really good uptime that synergizes with your cooldowns, especially with like the jackpot tier set for elemental. It often synergizes together with the random procs of that. So, and then when it does, it's just a ton of extra damage. So for Shaman, just slot in Void Ritual and then forget about it. Very similar to the class of Shaman, Warlocks are also going to be utilizing the Void Ritual, as all three specs utilize secondary stats in a variety of different ways, and all of them are generally good when it comes to increasing the performance of your damage, from fairly strong masteries, haste, critical strike, and even in some cases versatility. So because of the uptime of all these stats, it can also line up with some of your smaller cooldowns that you would use in between of your like 1 minute, 2 minute cooldowns. So it ends up working out really, really well for that spec specifically because of the good uptime. It just ends up being a really straightforward option. Void Ritual if you're playing a Warlock. And finally, we have the class of Warrior. Right now for Warriors, Void Ritual with the secondary stats as well as Echoing Void are actually very, very close. Basically equivalent amount of damage, but with Echoing Void being, you know, not as good right now, it's kind of broken, Void Ritual just comes out on top, just because it ends up being a very, very consistent option. Secondary stats for both Arms and Fury are strong enough to justify running Void Ritual. I mean, you're just going to see a lot more damage output through those alone, whether you talk about single target or AoE. And the reason why Void Ritual ends up being good for prot is also for the defensive but also offensive bonuses. Defensively, you can increase stats like haste, which can generate more resources, mastery, which is defensive, versatility, which is defensive, crit, which can also be offensive and defensive because of increased chance to parry. So it basically ends up being a good hit-all option. And right now it looks like Warriors are going with a very simple go with Void Ritual, but at least it's a very consistent one that works well for all three specs. So with that being said, as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching and hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community if you want to keep up with all the newest class changes or patch notes for the season. But also let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.